of the darkness, echoing, exploring Ireland's places of famine, death, and rebellion. And we should, I guess, before starting, confess that we're friends. So this is, as David said, really a chat between friends. I'm very proud to have a cameo in the book. So that's why hopefully you'll enjoy the conversation today. It should be fun, even though it is about Ireland's places of famine, death, and rebellion. So Gillian, thank you so much for joining us for Cork World Book Festival.
You're very welcome. I'm sorry that we're not doing it in person. I was going to deny knowing you, but now that you outed us.
I was, aware you were writing the book and heard all about it and came on a few jaunts. And when I started reading it, I kind of realized just what an organizational challenge it was to organize things kind of with chronology and with geography and with theme in mind. Can you tell us how you did that? Did you have a massive map with a bit of string on it? Or I know you had a lot of moleskin notebooks, but how did you do it?
Well, I did genuinely. I have a map where I've marked out in red across the map everywhere I've been. And so there was a case where I would, return back home of an evening and I would take out a red marker and literally mark it on the map. And there was something very satisfying about doing that. And there's a real mix between planning the journeys and then planning the book, because they were totally different. Because obviously when you were doing the journeys, if I was in Cork, I would try and look at a whole range of sites in Cork, but they weren't all necessarily thematically related to each other. And so you'd end up with a huge quantity of information. And then the real challenge, I think, was to try and assemble all of that information that I carried from maybe 200 sites around the country into kind of thematic chapters so that it would make sense to a reader without sort of it being really jarring. And so there were some that were quite easy to do. So the famine was going to be relatively straightforward, but others were much more complicated, like how do you tell the story of emigration at sites across the country? So that was a real challenge. It was one of the most difficult things to do once I decided I was writing the book, is to actually, how do you frame it so that there is a kind of a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I think one of the ways to do that was to pick 6 topics. So death was one, where I looked at cemeteries and how we deal with that, and famine and emigration, and then maritime disasters, because obviously with Ireland being a small island nation, there's a huge amount of kind of maritime disasters, most of which don't get very much attention. We focus on the Titanic, the Lusitania, and kind of the Odd. And I wanted to look more broadly, so you'd have to try and find other smaller stories. So I could see gaps and then you'd fill them, but it was something that cost a huge amount of thought over the course of a few years.
I can imagine, and it's so engagingly written, in that you're covering quite complex topics of Irish history, but it's clear. And, it's not a giant tome. So I think the other thing I found was that it was so easy to read, and that you were there, Alistair was there, which was as a kind of a stoic sidekick. And then, nieces and nephews and, the children of friends. And it's nothing like the academic writing that you have to do if you're aiming for something peer reviewed, or you're writing a monograph on some historical subject, which you have done as well. So how do you strip away all of that kind of academic writing, not discipline, but the kind of training of it to write? Was it hard to sit down and write yourself into a book, I suppose?
Yeah, I think that was one of the hardest things to do, because I think, when you're working in a university and you're teaching students, you try and you teach them, and you're taught when you're a student yourself, to take yourself out of the story, and to use a lot of the passive voice of things happened, and you're never part of it, and it's very little of it is about your own opinion. It's things that are backed up with weight of evidence and footnotes and all of that. And so this book is really different because I appear in it, as do half of my friends and family and people who were dragged around. And I found that really difficult because I wasn't very comfortable writing about myself and putting myself in it. But I think when I decided to write a book about Ireland and misery and death, you also have to inject certain humor into it. And there's nothing, and there's no way that you would want to make that, the horrors of the famine in any way humorous, because really they're not. And there's no way of finding humor in that. But where you can find humor is in your experience, or in my experience, at sites where kind of ridiculous things happened, or we got trapped in a cell, or we tagged on, and you were with me on that trip where we tagged on to a group of Americans who were on a field trip to Dunbrody famine ship, and we essentially stowed away on their tour. So the humor had to be extra and not part of the story. And I think the only way of making a story about Ireland's miserable past relatively light was being able to put in those anecdotes, and the only way I could do that was by putting me in the story, and that was quite difficult to do. And it was great bringing kids with me, and because you could use them as foils, because their experience of the stories which they were coming to knew was always kind of refreshing, and new ways to look at it. I remember being in your Clockgate Tower, where I think you were there that day, and turning around, and one of the kids that was with us, who was 11 or 12 at the time, and she was of an age where she could have been imprisoned there. And it's those sort of things where you realize, oh my God, you're on a kind of a trip out, but actually by 11 or 12, they could have been imprisoned for all sorts of petty crimes. So bringing people with me really helped, I think, in changing my perception of how you tell a story.
In a way, what one of the things you do is to research and write museum texts, and so you bring your own kind of sense of how you would have done it, and it's kind of refreshing then to have people who have none of that background, and just, as you say, coming to it fresh and without maybe the same expectations or thoughts on how it might have been done, which is refreshing. I suppose because we're going to be talking a lot about dark tourism, it would be useful, before we go any further, to just outline what that is for people who haven't heard about dark tourism or who are unfamiliar with the concept.
I think the idea of dark tourism is something that sort of academics have been talking about for sort of 30 odd years or so. And it really is, dark tourism covers a huge spectrum of sites, and it's any site really that tells a story that's associated with death or suffering or misery in some way. But there is this really broad spectrum or shades of darkness. So the darkest sites would be sites like concentration camps, where you go to those sites sort of almost as a form of pilgrimage. There's no commercialization associated with them. You don't go to the gift shop and buy kind of branded toys associated with it. And there's nothing, it's really there as an educational space. But then there are ones that sort of mix education and entertainment. So there is this sort of, dark, very dark sites, and then there are, shades of darkness as you go. And in Ireland, we have sites that, are both educational and there for entertainment, and we've ones that are primarily there for education. But we have a lot which touch on, very dark periods of our past, and we might not brand them as dark tourism. It's not a term that Fáilte Ireland tends to want to use. But, we have loads of prison sites that you can go to see. We've got loads of cemeteries you can go to see. We've got sort of things like Titanic Belfast. They're all about suffering and death, even if we don't think of that when we get up on a Saturday morning and head off, or at least when we did pre-COVID, and head off to a site. So Ireland is absolutely full of sites that are about, miserable or things that happened in our past.
It's interesting because you're right. You don't. I mean, I have to say, I don't think I could ever visit a concentration camp. I think it would just be too upsetting. But they do have, millions of visitors every year, and it's interesting to think about that, the idea of a visitor profile. Who's visiting and why. And do you think that Irish museums have a particular kind of visitor? Like, is it the idea of we're the most oppressed people ever, and people come to Ireland to have dark tourism experiences, or is it a diaspora who come and they've been told these dark stories and are visiting this dark past? Who are the people who are visiting, or is it a real mixture?
I think it's a real mixture of those who come, and I don't think there's anybody who decides to come to Ireland and says I'm going to go because of the dark past. Though I think you might get quite a lot of Irish Americans who go because their families may have left, or they think their families left during the famine. But I don't think that's kind of the reason. They don't go back thinking we're going to see this darkness. I think there's a certain, I guess in Ireland, there's a real, we have a comfort or an ease in talking about death that I haven't found in a lot of other places. So there is a humor about sort of death and misery that we will talk about in a very easy fashion. So I don't think anyone would ever really think that if they go to Glasnevin Cemetery, that that's particularly dark or macabre. But when you really think about it, you're going to a site where 1 million people are buried, and you're listening to stories about all sorts of awful ways in which they died and those sort of things. And that is definitely, dark tourism, but I don't think we think of it in that way. Or if you go to Kilmainham Jail, or you go to Spike Island, or Cork City Jail, or Wicklow Jail, there's a reason why we've got 11 or 12 sites about incarceration, and people are prepared to pay and go to them. There's obviously a market there, and I think it is both a local market, a national market, and then I think, if you look at the figures, it's also an international market. Everyone likes a bit of misery too. I think maybe it's because it makes you feel better about yourself that you're not in a prison, but it's okay to go and spend a few hours in one.
It's interesting. I not that I have like skin in the game, but I kind of worked in I worked for the Irish Heritage Trust, who had taken over Stokestown Park, which is that large house that has the National Famine Museum attached to it. And I sat one day and I read all of the TripAdvisor reviews, and one review was like, it sort of wasn't sad enough. Like, I didn't feel very upset. I was way more upset at Belsen than I was at the National Irish Famine Museum. And it was amazing, because that they were really expecting to feel upset, or that the exhibition would be emotive, when actually the exhibition there is quite statistical. Is there a kind of an audience who are going because they want to be shocked or upset? Or
I think so, and I think I've spent a lot of time over the last few years watching audiences. So I'll go on a tour, but I'll actually be watching the other people on the tour. As much as anything else, because very often I'm going on repeat visits to sites that I know quite well. And watching audience reaction to the stories that they're being told is often very interesting, and to see what sort of generates the most attention. I had one, and generally speaking, I have to say everyone is very respectful. There was only one instance where people weren't, which was at Crumlin Road Jail, where they do a really, really good tour, but you go into the execution chamber, and there was a group of guys who were on a stag weekend, and they thought that was kind of something that you could joke about, and it was they behaved inappropriately, as opposed to the guys who shut them down, and that was not allowed. But generally speaking, I don't find that you find that people do pay quite a lot of attention, and they are respectful in places that are sites of incarceration. And I think there's something about going to a prison museum, because for most people, they won't ever have been in a prison, and certainly not a working prison, and most people would do their best to avoid ever having to be in a prison. And those prison museums give you an opportunity to look kind of behind the scenes at places that you would never previously have been allowed to go into. And I think there is something of a draw about that a place that was previously sort of forbidden to the general public, being able to go in and sit in a cell and close a door for 5 minutes, has that sort of authenticity that you get.
I'm not sure. I think that's Gillian that's frozen there. Is it, Sasha?
Yeah.
We'll just wait for her to come back again. Hopefully she will rejoin us in a moment.
The problem with doing these, as much as we love them, and there's such an international reach with these Zoom calls now, there's always the technical issues.
So it's a slight technical issue. We'll ask her to repeat. Can we just get a message from people to say that they can still see us in the chat, if that's okay? Can you just let us know that we're still live? We've lost Gillian. I'm sure she's going to come back to us soon. Yes, all good, brilliant. Thank you, Claire. Thanks, Susanna and Mary, David. Thank you. So we're just going to invite Gillian to rejoin us. Here she comes. Hooray! You just unmute. You're on mute, Gillian. I think when you come back into the call. Sorry. Great.
I can see you. Maybe it's my own version of incarceration.
We missed a bit of the story there. I think one of the funniest bits in the book, I mean, you couldn't really make it up, is when you actually did get locked into the jail.
Yes, I mean, that was definitely unexpected. So we had gone to visit a museum in Glenties in Donegal, and as part of a lot of that museum is about Glenties and the history of Glenties, and quite a lot about John McGahern and various other sort of literary things. But attached to the general museum is also the old courthouse, which is now since closed. And as part of your tour, you can go and visit the cells that form the part of the basement of the courthouse. So we were allowed out across the prison yard and into the courthouse cells, which we looked around, and it was a miserable cold September day with absolutely lashing rain. And when we tried to get back into the museum itself, we couldn't, because all the doors were locked, and we found ourselves stuck between the prison cells and the prison yard with no prospect of escape. So I thought, well, we'll just ring. When we rang, and the number rang out and rang out and rang out, and it was now getting dark, and we were convinced that everyone had gone home. So Alistair, my husband, was with me, and he had to scale this 8-foot high fence topped with barbed wire in order to get out onto the road. But he eventually got back into the museum. They were like, oh, we had no idea. We didn't realize you were missing. And he said, oh, we rang you. And they said, oh, that number doesn't ring here. We don't know where that rings. So there was a sort of accidental getting stuck in the kind of prison yard, which did, at the time, did not find entertaining, because I was getting soaking wet and really thought we could be there for the night. But in retrospect, it gave a very good example of kind of what it would be like to be accidentally imprisoned for a while.
I love the passing shot where they said, you won't tell anyone.
Yeah, they asked as we left, they said, would you mind signing the guest book, and don't tell anyone. And so I signed the guest book and went, no, that's fine, but mention it. The museum itself, though, has some really great things in it. And I actually really enjoyed the experience, apart from the bit where we couldn't leave.
See, it's funny, like, about, the idea, especially of prisons, you're in a place where you'd never usually get to go, and there are feelings in buildings, like there are you sense calm or fright, or there are places that people really do believe are haunted, and they don't feel comfortable. I thought, and it was just kind of looping back to the Famine Museum, I thought that your description of the Kilkenny famine, the workhouse interpretation was really interesting. That actually there's nothing left, but the stories were so well told that it was really moving.
Yeah, the Kilkenny place was really odd, and so there is a famine, an audio-visual tour you can do in McDonagh Junction Shopping Centre, which is primarily a modern shopping centre, full of done stores and everything you expect to find in a modern shopping centre. But part of the site was the old workhouse, and some of the walls still stand, and the yard of the workhouse is still there. And so you can go in and you go to the reception desk of this sort of, all shiny, all tiled, all bright lights shopping centre, and you get this audio guide. And then you're sent out with your earphones into the food court. The food court is, full of, there's a kids' playground, and they were playing the theme music from Frozen the film, and people were, queuing up for Starbucks. And then you press play in your earphones, and it starts saying, people were starving, and this is Ireland's the 1840s. And there's a real disconnect between the noises and the smells. And I thought, oh, this is just going to be a comic piece that I'm going to write about how this just seemed really inappropriate. And then you spend the next 40 minutes as they move you around the site to areas that would have been, say, the women's dormitory, and where the kids would have been, and where the doctors were. And they've done it beautifully. It's really remarkably moving. So you're walking between the shoppers going into Boots and, you know, Holland and Barrett and whatever else is there in the thing, while hearing these stories of, you know, famine and destitution of the mid 1840s, and then you come out and you just pass Lifestyle Sports, and there's a statue of these two boys that the story had largely been about. And at the bottom of the base of this memorial statue are 940 fingerprints of 940 people from Kilkenny who represent the around 940 bodies that were found in that vicinity from the workhouse. And it's remarkably moving. And I had been very skeptical, thinking there's no way they can make this work. And, you know, I think they've done a brilliant job. I think whoever owns the shopping centre has done this where they didn't need to, where they could have just kind of ignored the history. And they've done it really well. And it's, if anyone's in Kilkenny, it's absolutely worth doing. So those things were great, because I think we've been in the Medieval Mile Museum, and a guy has said, oh, if you want something that's not medieval Kilkenny, have a look at that. And off we went. So I loved those unexpected kind of things that really worked, where I had no expectations that they would.
It's interesting. I think I saw Johnny Grieber talk about the excavation of that cemetery at the Famine conference, and I had a little cry, because it just was so, because he was able to get to kind of, they were almost diagnostically trying to work out why certain people had died, and they'd found that there just was this disproportionate number of 3-year-old children, and they realized that it's because they were separated from their mothers at that age, and they went into a kind of shock. I mean, I think those kind of, it's like, it seemed like those stories in Kilkenny were very well researched, and it was a very good piece of weaving a narrative of a person through a museum. And I suppose that's a good example, if you like, of storytelling interpretation. But it's something that Fáilte Ireland are very keen on. Are there good and bad examples of that storytelling interpretation out there?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things I noticed on my trips around is that when stories are well told, that's the thing that sticks with you, because you can tell all these stories about, you know, 1 million people, or, you know, 1,500 people, or 1,000 people. That means very little to me, because I can't, in my head, can't really see what that is. And where those stories worked was where you had a name or an example. And where they were well done is where they were where they didn't try and just tell a really simplistic story, because nobody's life is straightforward and nobody's life is without contradiction. And so the stories that really work best, I think, are the stories where you have that contradiction is allowed, and you're allowed kind of hold multiple versions of kind of going, oh, not so sure that person was a particularly good person, but they weren't all bad. We do have a tendency to be quite black and white, and to, you know, you take one side or the other. And where it works best, I think, is where it is much more nuanced than that, because, you know, people change, as I think that's where we can find people that we can recognize, because, you know, as ourselves, we don't always think the same way, or we change our minds over time. And those are kind of really important things to, you know, the past was just as complicated as the present.
Yeah. And Irish history is extremely complicated. And I suppose that there is a danger of oversimplifying that, you know, things that are complicated, especially in a museum setting where you're trying to communicate it to as many people as possible, or especially when you're trying to do it through a story.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely the case. And it's interesting, the different sort of approaches that there are. So, you know, because I'm in Liverpool at the moment, and when I talk to my students and they mention Oliver Cromwell, they don't automatically go, oh, evil Oliver Cromwell. Whereas in Ireland, that's your immediate reaction, is that Oliver Cromwell and the siege of Drogheda and the massacre of people there. And you forget that there are other stories that are also told about him, which are quite different. And if you're coming from a different perspective. So I think it's that there are all sorts of different ways of telling stories. And I think being open to contradiction. I mean, I'm always happy to have, you know, somebody say, well, what did you not think about looking at this? And you're like, oh, well, that does change how I would look at that. And that's quite hard to do when you've only got 150 words on a panel in a museum, to say, actually, we also have other ways that we could possibly tell this same story. I think the thing that I found on my trips around is I was always looking for the little things, you know, not the big showcase bits, but the bits where you can kind of go, oh, somebody owned that once, you know, whatever it was that you could imagine yourself also owning, you know, the ordinary things. As I think that's where people find more ways of tying into a story that could be similar to their own story, just happening, you know, at a different time, rather than the stories, the big men of history, that we wouldn't necessarily ever be in those positions, but, you know, the stories of ordinary people, I think, are the ones that hit home more.
I suppose they're the hardest to tell, you know.
Yeah, because ordinary people leave very little behind, and, you know, what we keep, what's kept tends to be the sort of stuff of the wealthy, and most people aren't and weren't wealthy. So trying to find that ephemera of everyday life, and trying to, you know, tell stories about that, is really hard to do, and I really like finding them when they're done well. So up in Belfast, there are 2 little perfume vials on display in the Titanic exhibition, which is not Titanic Belfast, but it's part of the Ulster Museum. And those 2 tiny little vials of perfume came from the seabed after the Titanic sunk. And they tell the story of a man who was going off to seek his fortune by becoming a perfumer in New York. And it's sort of that story of lost dreams and broken dreams and potential, all of those things. I find those sort of things really quite moving.
And actually, where there are so few possessions, to find that historical evidence, in our world where we just throw things away all the time, and we're just over consuming of how little people had. I was really struck by the little piece of mirror and the list of what a whole community owned in the book. That was very striking.
Yeah, and I think particularly around the famine, and I think one of the things about the famine, it's really hard to tell the famine story with stuff, because we don't have the stuff, because people didn't have things. You know, so we have, you know, those big famine pots, but we don't have anything that really links us to the individuals. And there is this tiny shard of mirror up in Strokestown, in Roscommon, and it's about the size of my hand. And alongside it is a list that was assembled by a teacher in Gweedore in Donegal in 1837, so just before the famine. And in it, it lists what the population of that area had, which was a population of 4,000 people. And they had things like 2 feather beds, 7 shovels, like hardly anything, 4 forks. You know, the material culture of that community is tiny, and they had this one shard of mirror, because what need would you have of a mirror when you're living a life on the margins, where, you know, you're just about surviving? You're certainly not looking at yourself and going, I wonder, is my hair okay for today? And I think it's those sort of things that you go, oh my God, that's how close they were, you know, to the margins of surviving and not surviving, that they had so little. And it's those small things that I think trigger, I think, an empathy with people of that period, in a way that if you tell me 4,000 people died, doesn't, because I can't compute that sort of information.
Yeah, and I think, you know, what I really struck me when I was reading the piece on incarceration, and just the list of crimes, like how the ages of people who were deemed to be criminal and what they stole. I mean, what they stole, and the sentences that were they were given, was just shocking, you know, for stealing a handkerchief, and
stealing a turnip, running on a train. There's all sorts of tiny infractions that nobody would even, you know, turn their head to look at today. And you were getting children aged as young as 13 being placed in places like, you know, Cork City Jail or Kilmainham Jail for things that really weren't offences. And you particularly find that during the famine, is the tiniest things that could land you into prison. One of the things that is interesting, I always find about prison museums, which I'm particularly interested in, is that we do talk about those tiny infractions, which really aren't crimes at all, but were deemed crimes, but we hardly ever talk about the victims. I mean, a lot of people were in prison for very serious offences, whether that was murder or rape or all sorts of things. And the stories of victims are very rarely considered at sites, which I think is an oversight and something that we might need or try to change, is to think about. And I think one of the interesting things, I used to go and talk to people at the end of tours at the prison sites and ask them what they found most interesting, and they always were interested in the prisoners. So they were, either they would talk about how they had a relative who'd done time, or they really liked the story of, whatever it was. Maybe there's a guy in Spike Island who called Jack in the Box, who used to, him and his friends, they'd parcel him up. So he would fold into a box, and then they would parcel him up and send him from Dublin to Cork. And he would go in the train with all of the goods that were being sold, but that were being sent down to Cork, and he would come out of his box, and then he would steal from all the other packages and then get back into his box and be collected at Cork Station or Galway or wherever. And that's the sort of thing that really catches people's imagination, because there isn't really, there are obviously victims, but there's no harm being done to any individual, personally to any individual. But what was interesting is nobody ever said to me, I really, my great grandfather was a prison officer, and so the stories of the guards were interesting, or they never said that. And I always wondered, is it because the museums that we have open today of prisons mostly closed before the Irish Free State came into existence in 1922, and it's very easy for us to go, well, that was all run by the English or the British, so we were the innocent Irish, and that's why we see ourselves as being kind of the victims the same way as the prisoners, and don't see any connection between us possibly and the prison guards. Because of course there were loads of people, Irish people, related to the prison guards, but not one person ever came and said that to me.
That's amazing. That's very interesting. Is it a case of just because often the prison records are existent in the public domain, it's just easier to get to them than researching the stories of the victims?
Yeah, I mean, it is that, but in the later part, there are court case records, and you can tell some stories about some of the victims, and in some places we do. And one that I'm familiar with, because I worked on the Spike Island one, is a guy called James Kerwin, who was known as the Ireland's Eye Killer. And James Kerwin was a slightly well-known painter, and he went out painting off Howth onto Ireland's Eye with his wife, and she didn't come back because she drowned, and it was deemed by a court that he had drowned her, that this had not been an accidental drowning. And then it was discovered that he was living in pretty much city centre, but he also had a second family. So he was married to the woman that he killed, and he had a long-term relationship with another woman, and he had 8 children by that other woman, and somehow neither woman knew of the other. And that was an absolute cause célèbre, because he was a little bit known, and we do know about his wife. And so her story is told. He ends up being found guilty of murder, and he goes and he's sent to Spike Island. And he was such a cause célèbre that he wasn't allowed to go out on work the way a lot of the prisoners did, and where they did building or various things outside of the prison. He wasn't allowed to do that because he was such a cause célèbre and so well known that they had to keep him within the walls, where he painted the chapel. He did artwork on the chapel. So there are all sorts of if it's a famous story, we can find out about the victims. If it's not, then it's obviously more difficult.
It brings us to that point, doesn't it, of museums really need to tell stories from multiple perspectives. If they can do that well, then it's a kind of a more rounded museum experience.
Yeah, and then you get to kind of choose and think about, and also you get to hold contradictory thoughts in your head at the same time, which I think we're generally opposed to. But I think you really need, dealing with history, you need to be able to hold these contradictory thoughts and go, okay, on the one hand there's this, and on the other hand there's that.
Oh yeah, I think Sean Moncrief actually recently called that the Irish superpower, of being able to hold 2 completely opposing opinions in your head and be able to kind of balance them, and that to be okay. And I think we do need to teach people that, because you know, I think in Sean Moncrief's articles, people are becoming very strident, and you have to have very strong opinions about everything now, especially on social media. Like, I don't scroll on Twitter, or I don't look at the comments of the journal. I'd never ever go to the comments, because people are so opinionated. I think history is a really powerful tool for teaching people, you know, there are loads of perspectives, or there, you know, there's more than one way of looking at this, you know. Maybe the perpetrator was a victim, but that perpetrator had a victim too, you know.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I mean, I think you know, Twitter is you know, forces everyone to have a very strong opinion about everything in 240 or 280 characters, whatever it is. And I think that's really damaging to debate. I mean, I'm always amazed at how many people have really strong opinions about so many things that they all seem to be experts on. I find it hard to be an expert on, you know, the stuff I am actually an expert on. And I generally don't want to shout my opinion about it anyway. But I'm constantly amazed at all of these people who seem to know everything about everything. And I think that is sort of problematic. And in the museum or on my trips, one of the things where I did have to try and hold to contradictory thoughts at the same time is with the display of human remains. So, you know, if you go, say, to the National Museum and you see the bog bodies there, which have been, you know, remarkably preserved over several, you know, millennia in some cases. And you can see, you know, the fingernails, you can see their skin, you can see the hair on their heads. And it is amazing. And every time I go there, it is amazing. And you look at them and think, this is, you know, remarkable that I can see someone who was alive and actually see what they looked like. And at the same time, you're looking at them going, they didn't give permission. We're putting human remains on display without, certainly, absolutely without the permission of those people. But I can hold those two thoughts absolutely simultaneously by going, oh my God, this is fantastic that I get to see it, and also feel a little uncomfortable about that. And so I think it is possible to, you know, have both competing perspectives, and depending on the day, I feel more strongly one way than the other. Well,
I'm going to tell you about my competing perspectives now, because I stood up at a talk just before COVID. I think I was a little stressed that day, or, you know, we'd been running multiple events in non-naval place, and then I ran down and did this talk, and I think I was I came across, I was emotional. I was kind of giving out about this weird life that you lead when you run a museum, and you're very sympathetic about people who run museums and have weddings and do all these different things. And I was talking about the idea of museums and communities, and how it's so important. And there's you know, most of the museum theory out there, if you read it, like an awful lot of the research generated is about museums and their role as places of benefit to local communities. I think it probably comes from mainly English academics, and they're talking about government museums and national museums and things like that. And, you know, I believe in that. I believe that museums should be the place where their local community go to spend leisure and learn and relax and make memories together. But then, and I generate statistics around that. We have events. We try and work out, you know, how many people from different areas have come to our events. We're trying to see, are we always reaching new people? Are people using us in that way? And it's really important to us. And people like the Arts Council, the Heritage Council, they want to know how many people came on Heritage Week and where did they come from? And then I have another set of statistics and another kind of taskmaster in Fáilte Ireland, and they don't care. They say, don't care how many people came on Culture Night, don't care about Heritage Week, don't care that you managed to have 20 deaf schools, you know, in a month. That doesn't matter. We want to know how many tickets you've sold, and how many of those people were from outside of Cork, and how many of those people were from outside of Ireland. And that's what we want to know, and that's what we're going to judge you on. And that is actually totally schizophrenic. I have to hold both of those things in my head at the same time. And you know, you said, you know, you had words to say about Fáilte Ireland. You have words to say about museums as places that should represent their communities. What should I do, Gillian?
Well, I think that it's a real and genuine problem, because I think the big problem in Ireland is that there's one major funder of tourism sites, and that's Fáilte Ireland. And Fáilte Ireland's remit is essentially, or at least was up until COVID, was to get foreign tourists in, and that they're essentially a marketing agency and they have their particular agenda. And I am not opposed to their existence or to them having that agenda to bring tourists in. But what I am opposed to is that they essentially hold the purse strings to everything, so that every museum who wants to get funding has to go through them and has to go along with the themes that they've decided, whether that's Ireland's ancient East or whatever part that they're in. And I think that actually the tourists are more intelligent than we give them credit for. Because I think that tourists who are coming from abroad can actually go to a museum that is, fundamentally aimed at a more local audience, and get something out of it, that it doesn't need to all be broad brushstrokes, and that they don't have to be you don't have to be quite as schizophrenic. You're forced into it the way it's run in Ireland and the way funding is run, but that doesn't need to be the case. And it would be very easy to disentangle some of those funding streams and make them, separate them and make the applications for them very different. But I think I am talking to myself largely. I'm certainly not talking to Fáilte Ireland or the relevant ministers on this. But it is, I am extremely sympathetic. I mean, I know in the book I do think it's very odd that people would choose to get married in a prison, and it does put a whole new frame on the idea of a ball and chain when you talk about weddings. I mean, and they're great for photographs, but there is something slightly, I would feel uncomfortable about that. But I'm equally totally conscious of the fact that these sites have to make money. If they don't make money, then they can't stay, they can't remain open. And what would we rather? Would we rather they were derelict? Would we rather they were demolished? Would they rather, that they were turned into apartments? So how do you balance that? And I'm extremely sympathetic to sites that sort of have to find ways to turn a profit, even if they're not ways that I would particularly want to go down myself if I was given the choice.
Well, a lot of sites, one of their revenue streams is the gift shop, and I love the section on the gift shop in the book. And I love the collection of trinkets. Do you have them in a special case? All of these things that you've gathered from around Ireland.
I do. I have a sort of like my cabinet of curiosities, which I now need to make a bigger cabinet of curiosities. I mean, a museum shop is a joy, and I often start in a museum shop. And some are better than others, and some have kind of very bespoke things associated with them, and so. So anywhere I go, I think one of my favorite is from the Museum of Orange Heritage, which is a little Lego orange man. That somebody has just put an orange sash on, and you can buy there. I mean, there's all sorts of kind of weird and wonderful. I have to say, Nano Nagel Place shop is one of my favorite shops. It doesn't have orange men for sale, but other than that, it's great. I think maybe we should have a nun for sale. You could have a Lego nun.
Talk about that, because people do love pictures of sisters in habits, and we do have a few fridge magnets that have that, because it's the mementos that people want to take away, and it's like to generate gifts that are authentic without being gimmicky is a tricky one.
It's true. And I mean, some of the sites, and you can sometimes tell who they're aimed at, is some of sites have museum shops that are essentially just parachuted in from carols. And it's woolly sheep in slipper form, in t-shirt form, in keyring form, and that they're not being aimed at bringing back a kind of a repeat local audience, because it's very much aimed at the transitory visitor who comes once. But museum shops, I mean, I often both start and end my visit in a museum shop.
Actually, yeah, and my sister-in-law says that she just goes to shop in the cafe, and she lets other people do the museum. But It's funny. I mean, I suppose again for small museums, to actually curate a shop is a huge amount of work, and we now have a retail manager. Well, we were the National Visitor Store of the Year 2020. I'm just saying, and you know, I can see why people do just have to, you know, tick a box and buy from a company that will deliver everything to them without them having to really think about it too much.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, though, that if places want to kind of develop a brand, being able to, and there are shops, you know, not just yours, but others which have and do showcase local, you know, jewelry makers and local, you know, those sort of things that are for sale, and people might go and buy gifts. And I think there's a case to be made for having a mix of both. But as you say, it is really difficult to do, and it costs money to stock a shop, and it's not something that every site can afford to do.
You talk about in the book about two of my favorite, essentially fake shops, it has to be said, which is Rita Duffy's shop and then the John Byrne, both of which I saw, and I really regret not buying a Castle of the Border. Would you tell us a bit about those?
Well, both of those are, I guess, they're kind of art pieces in many ways. So there was a kind of border site. It was right on the border where you could buy like a sod of turf, of border turf, and it was done almost as a site-specific art installation. And it opened, you know, very briefly and then closed. I think there's a great film of Kevin McAleer doing the official opening of that shop. And then, as part of the centenary of the 1916 Rising, there was the other, which has just got out of my head.
To Duffy. I can't remember the name of the shop.
It's got out of my head too, but the shop essentially sold items that you could actually buy. So there were things like Carson's orange marmalade, and various other products that were sort of associated with Irish history, and she had branded them as Irish history, I guess, products. And in a way, she was sending up the commercialization of commemoration. And, you know, in a way, sometimes you can't even send that up, because you could go down the road to Carol's and buy, you know, a 1916 bar of chocolate that had a picture of the 7 signatories of the 1916 proclamation, plus the proclamation on the front of it, and every other sort of like a 1916 hip flask, and anything you can possibly imagine. But I think they were really interesting as a, you know, responses to the commercialization of our past, and it's not just in Ireland that happens, but I guess it was most obvious recently with 1916.
I have to say, I have we went to the shop when it was in Skibbereen, and I have a Make Your Own Markovich, which is a paper dolly with Countess Markovich in the middle in her corset, and you can either cut out a picture of her in her tsunami uniform, or you can cut out a picture of her as a debutante, and you can switch them, and I absolutely love it. And some friends have the Carson's orange no surrender marmalade as the thing that they keep their toothbrushes in now, and I'm very jealous, and I wish I'd bought one when they were for sale. It was so clever and just on point. Well, I suppose we should wrap up. It's just 10 to 6 now, and I suppose what for a Cork audience, what dark tourism sites would you recommend to visit in the Cork area?
Well, Cork is great. I think I've nearly as many sites in Cork as I had in Dublin, and I get that I visited. I mean, now that things are hopefully going to open up, there is a huge range. I mean, obviously, I would send everyone to Spike Island because I worked on it. But I found Youghal Clockgate Tower is great, and particularly for kids, they do a really, really interesting tour, and only part of it is about how the place was once a jail. Kilmurray Independence Museum is a really good example of a community-driven museum that tells the story of Irish independence, not just the War of Independence, which it does kind of focus on because of its location and a lot of the artifacts, but they've done a really lovely job, and it's really well worth going. Of all of the sites around kind of the War of Independence and Civil War, I like the Kilmurray Museum the best. If you go to Cove, which I don't think this is visited as much as it ought to be, but Cove Museum, which is in a tiny little Presbyterian church, you know, at the top of the hill, which amazing views out over the harbour. but they have some really interesting artifacts associated with the Lusitania that are very moving. And the museum itself is tiny, but I think it's well worth a trip to. I'm a big fan of Finbarr's Cathedral, which isn't necessarily associated with dark tourism, but my favorite thing in the cathedral is, and I don't know why they've done this, but hanging from the ceiling in the cathedral is a cannonball. You know, alongside all of the other religious paraphernalia, you've got this cannonball hanging down. And it's there because in 1690, the cannonball was fired from Elizabeth Fort, which is just up from the cathedral, and it lodged in the steeple of the cathedral. And in the mid-19th century, when there was work done on the steeple, they found the cannonball and somebody said, I know, we'll hang it inside the cathedral for no apparent reason. So if you go into Finbarr's Cathedral, you'll find that cannonball, which I always like. And then obviously there are places like, you know, Charles's Fort out in Kinsale, which is great and also not so great because you don't really learn much about it. It's an amazing walk. The views and the sights and the site itself is fabulous, but the interpretation is really limited. So you could go out there 10 times and not really know anything about the fort. But as a place to go on a sunny day, you know, why wouldn't you go to Charles Fort? And, you know, there's obviously Cork City Jail, which I've mentioned. But, you know, given the audience, and this is not dark tourism at all, everyone should go to Nanonagle Place. That should be their first port of call, and they should go repeatedly.
Well, absolutely. And we're very lucky to have you working on an exhibition that's going to launch in early August. Which is going to cover a very important event. So do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, wearing a totally different non-dark tourism hat, I worked on the exhibition that's currently the museum at Nanonagle Place. And we are doing a separate and new exhibition that we'll launch in the summer called Changing Habits, 250 Years of Convent Life. And it's to mark the fact that the original convent building, as built by Nanonagle, was built in 1771, and that building is still intact. So if you can see behind Danielle, if you can sort of climb behind that building, you would get as far as the 1771 building. And what is really remarkable about that is that it's not only that the building is 250 years old, but that building has been operating for that entire time as a convent. And, you know, we talked earlier about one of the great things about getting, where prison museums open and people get to see places they would never have seen. Up until really recently, you know, convents were in places that people could the general public could go into. And Nanonagle Place is very much behind high walls or behind a school. And so in the last few years, I think one of the great things about the opening of Nanonagle Place is that you get in and you can get to see behind the scenes. And, you know, one thing that Cork lacks is green space, public green space. And there is the most amazing garden. And it's sort of this little oasis. I mean, first time I went, she was like, this is a remarkable place. And obviously I'm very biased because I've worked on some of the projects, but I do think that it is a remarkable site, physical site, but it also has a remarkable story associated with it.
Yeah, and it's kind of, it has that magical thing of being kind of living heritage and site specific. So it's, you know, you're in the place where history happened and it's all still around you and the sisters are still resident. So it's,
yeah,
I'm biased.
Yeah, I mean, I think of all the trips I made, and obviously on this trip, you know, when I wrote The Darkness Echoing, I picked out the sites that kind of talked about the themes that I wanted to write about. But I did visit, you know, loads of other sites that didn't make it to the book. I think it's those site-specific places, you know, where you are, where the thing happened, rather than necessarily the new builds, that gives you a real sense of the past, and really helps you kind of engage with the stories that are being told. And certainly in my experience, they're the ones that I enjoy the most.
Yeah, I guess it's unique, isn't it? You can't experience that anywhere else, and that's just why it's so special.
Yeah, and that's why it would be great places open and we're not doing it all sort of remotely. We can all be sitting in these places again.
I can see we've got one question, and there may be some more questions to come. So we'll invite questions now, and we will invite Sasha back to join us to help us field those questions.
Just to say, Gillian, thanks so much. That was such an entertaining and inspirational talk. I actually was laughing out loud at a lot of things you said. So, so I'll just ask the question we have in the Q&A box, which is from James Bell in New Jersey. So he said, in the United States, we're having a strong debate around whether to preserve or remove memorials to Confederacy from the Civil War due to the current cultural sensitivities around racism. Are there memorials in Ireland that might be viewed differently today due to changing or evolving cultural points of view that you can think of?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have had that debate. I mean, what happened, a lot of the controversial statues over that were associated, say, with British military events, a lot of those were already removed, and were removed sort of in the post 1922 from the Free State time onwards. So there are a lot that have been taken down and that were replaced in most cases with some sort of nationalist monument. In 1966, you had the blowing up of Nelson's column or Nelson's pillar in Dublin, which took down that statue, and that was done by the IRA on the 50th anniversary of the 1916 Rising, or in the year of the 50th anniversary. So there have definitely been, that has been, and there are sort of ongoing debates about whether or not old statues remain. In Cork, there is the National Monument, which is my favorite name for anyone, which is for any monument. So in Cork, the National Monument marks 1798, 1848, 1867, and it gives that whole lineage of Irish struggle for independence. Now that itself is on the site of a statue of a king, King George II. So when they took that statue down, they replaced it with a nationalist monument. But there are remnants, and I guess this will be the case also possibly in the States. There are remnants of that statue. So if you look at the road sign just beside that statue, where it says Grand Parade in English, and above that it says Shroid an Capel Bui in Irish, which means the street of the yellow horse, which is the color of the horse that was the original statue. So you may get rid of the statue, but sort of remnants kind of remain kind of in people's folk memory. So it is an ongoing debate in Ireland. It's not as live, obviously, as it is in the States, because so many controversial statues were removed. But I think it is still, in fact, I had a conversation yesterday with the curator in the National Museum about controversial statues and what should be done with them. So it is something that is definitely being discussed. And as to, we were discussing whether or not removing them was enough, or whether they should be taken and placed in museums where they would then, form an educational thing where people would discuss why they were erected and then why they were removed, that it would become part of a discussion rather than, just getting rid of them and destroying them. So it is live, but possibly not quite as live an issue at the moment as it is in the US.
It's interesting, isn't it, that statues that were once very distasteful, and the IRA did try and blow up others, one in Dunleary, and they had a go at Prince Albert, who's next to the Natural History Museum, and that the desire to now remove Prince Albert has kind of faded away, and Prince Albert is seen as actually he was instrumental in helping found the National Gallery of Ireland, and seems to be quite an enlightened figure, and Prince Albert is now kind of happily tolerated there. So like what would have been a burning issue to get rid of him in the past has sort of faded, and he's sitting there, and nobody seems to mind. There was the amazing Queen Victoria on Leinster Lawn, and she ended up dumped behind Dangan School, I believe.
Then sold. I mean, the amazing story about that big statue that was outside Leinster House of Queen Victoria, where she gets removed up to Kilmainham, and then she's removed, and kind of they don't know what to do with her. And then years and years, like decades later, she eventually is sold to Sydney, the Australians buy her, and she is now on display in Sydney. So they make a bit of money out of her at the end. So sometimes there are all sorts of kind of remarkable stories about statues and why they get commissioned, why they get removed, who's behind them. And I think one of the interesting things about the blowing up of Nelson's Pillar is that a lot of people had really fond memories, because that's where people met to go on dates, and they could go up and look over Dublin city. So a lot of people didn't really think about Nelson, but they had a really fond association with the pillar as a symbol of Dublin. So there are all sorts of different people. Some people have a romantic association with that pillar, but it's got nothing to do with Nelson. And in the way that what replaced it, the Millennium Spire, I don't know anybody who thinks has any kind of emotional, other than negative emotional reaction to that. So it is a complicated story. Nelson's head is in one of the libraries in Dublin, in the Pearse Street Library. So you can go and see it still if you want to.
The more you know.
Yeah.
And just to give you a plug, Gillian, where can we get your book?
I'm hoping very soon in any bookshop when they reopen, but it can be bought online in pretty much any of the bookshops that have an online presence, like Kenny's or the Gutter Bookshop, all the independent ones, and also on Amazon. But we don't like to talk about Amazon, but I'm very happy for people to buy it wherever they'd like to buy it.
Well, to let you know, we do have signed copies.
Oh, you
signed
do?
copies. And our online shop will be opening again soon. It's closed at the moment, but hopefully we will be able to open soon, so you can get your copy in Cork in Nannanego Place.
Yes, do that first. That's definitely my recommendation.
I was trying to give Gillian the plug there, Daniel.
Sorry, never.
You didn't tee it up. I'd forgotten I had signed copies there.
And just one question from me. I know you had an article in the Examiner today, and I didn't get a chance to read it yet, but I'm wondering, could you give a brief synopsis of whether or not we should market Cork as a dark tourism destination?
Yes, I saw the headline. The headline isn't entirely representative of what the rest of the article is about. I mean, I think Cork, yeah, absolutely. I mean, yes, in a good way. I don't mean it as a place that's very miserable, but I think Cork has an amazing range of stories, and I'll get myself into all sorts of trouble probably with Cork people if I say this. I've been working on projects in Cork for about 6 years now, on a very regular basis, and I've had a lot to do with kind of Cork history. And I'm constantly surprised that the focus, and I'm not surprised for this year, but the focus of Cork history in terms of its publications and everything else is the War of Independence and the burning of Cork. And those are stories, obviously, that need to be told, but Cork's history is so much more interesting than just that early 20th century period. Cork City's 18th century history is absolutely fascinating, and that's obviously the period where Nana Nagle sets up her schools, but for all sorts of other reasons. But the whole county has just this amazing history that I don't think enough. And I say this as someone from Dublin, so I really do mean that there are so many more stories, I think, that can be told about the city and the county that should be told, and should get much more attention than they do. And I know everyone talks about West Cork and its beauty, and that is all true, but people should be going to Cork for kind of the museums and the stories that are being told there.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm a Corkonian myself, and I'd say there's so much history that I'm unaware of. So yeah, I think rather than the maritime city, we should be the dark tourism city, maybe.
I'm all for that.
So we haven't had any more questions, so I'm just wondering, would you like to wrap it up and go out and enjoy the sunshine?
Might be a good idea. I know we had a few comments in the chat. Do you want to just let it? I know there's some shame to leave comments unread, or just is there anything?
Oh yes, that is correct about Tourism Ireland being marketing for overseas and Fáilte Ireland for the home market. That is correct. I, for some reason, they interchange in my head very easily. Yeah, gift shopped items. I have done this in the past. Checked where they're all made. So few of those lovely bouncy lambs that you can buy and sheep saying I'm from Ireland are not actually from Ireland in any way. That is always something, and you think they take it off. I mean, obviously they can't take it off, but I would like to see a lot more homemade gifts in the gift shops. But yeah, China does very well out of the Irish tourism industry without having to do it ever appear here.
Well, on that note, we will exit through the gift shop. And thanks, Gillian. Gillian, thank you so much for joining us for Cork World Book Week. And you can buy her wonderful book in our bookshop or many other reputable bookshops. So there you go. And Gillian, have a lovely evening. And to everyone who joined us this evening, thank you so much. And keep your eyes peeled. We have lots more programming coming up, and I've already asked Gillian to speak again during the summer. So we'll be seeing you again very soon, Gillian.
I look forward to it. Thanks, Danielle. Thanks, Saoirse.